I'm Barbara Cohn. I'm here to talk about mixing wax and water, which you're supposedly not supposed to be able to do, but under certain circumstances and being very careful, one can get some wonderful effects doing exactly that. The reason that most of us like working with these two materials is because they're translucent, they layer beautifully, and the colors are gorgeous. So it makes sense if we can figure out a way to combine them and take advantage of those very properties that we all enjoy. Here are a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. These two pieces have water media, gouache and watercolor, as well as encaustic. So you're looking through the sheet of acetate. The actual paint in encaustic is on the back, which is also interesting. Some of you may prefer to have the work side out. Some of you may prefer to have the opposite side out, depending on how your light is going and what your purpose is. Here's another in a different color palette, just to give you an idea. This is mostly in reds, obviously. And the encaustic that was used on this one was the black encaustic. Different effect, but the same idea. This is mostly white encaustic with the blues and mostly black with the red. Okay, now I'd like to show you a little bit of how these things are made. As a bonus, it's a lot of fun, and you don't necessarily have to be an experienced watercolor artist or know much of anything about encaustic to make something absolutely beautiful. Here are some of the materials you're going to need to make these pieces. Starting with Duralar. Here's a small piece here. This is a large pad, but it comes in smaller pads. And this is a material that's treated to accept water media on both sides. You can work on either side of this material. Next is watercolor, tube watercolor, and gouache. The Daniel Smith Extra Fine Watercolor works particularly well, I believe. It's highly pigmented and it tends not to granulate nearly as much as some of the others. Although when there is some granulation, it's pretty interesting looking. You're going to need big watercolor brushes. In fact, the bigger the better. Big mop wash brushes, the squirrel or whatever you have is terrific to move the paint around. If you want brush strokes in your final piece, you can obviously use a smaller brush and actually do a drawing with the paint, whatever it is, whatever the effect you're after. Here is encaustic medium, a block of encaustic medium, and here is encaustic paint. For this process I use approximately half and half, but you could probably get away with 2/3 medium and maybe 1/3 encaustic, again depending on how translucent you want your paint. It's easiest for this process to work with the mini loaf pans of your melted encaustic, because you're going to be using your encaustic brush to dip it in, and it's nice just to have that amount of paint and also room to dip your larger brush. And here's one of your best friends, your spray bottle. You're going to be using this spray bottle a lot, as you see. So I use a big one because that way I don't have to refill it every 5 minutes. And I also use a large container of water. This is a very wet, watery, messy process, so the more water you have on hand, the better. And finally, you'll need a palette of some kind. This is a disposable palette, but you can use whatever you like, including dinner dishes or plastic disposable plates or the lids of things. I use all sorts of things, but the disposable palette is nice too for mixing colors. First, let's talk about preparing the surface of your work surface. This is, again, as I said, a very wet, messy process. So either work on a surface that won't be bothered by a lot of water, or do as I did, which was lay a piece of plexi down to protect the surface. I also have a piece of white paper underneath the plexi, and that's so that I can kind of see what I'm doing on this material. If you lay it over something with a pattern or you lay it over something dark, it can be hard to see what you're doing. Next, I laid 2 sheets of paper towels here, and that helps absorb some of the runoff and also keep this material a little steadier. It tends to want to slide around a little bit, so it gives it a little grip. First thing you want to do is your handy water bottle. You want to spray your acetate because you're going to work wet. Now I have some watercolors here on the palette. I'm going to spray that as well. And then I'm just going to start laying in color here. You can see where the watercolor is a little thicker in places, where there's actually a little bit of a pattern. That actually can look quite beautiful. Try some of the green. And you can see how you can see right through this. You see the white coming up from the bottom. And since you're going to probably mount this on white, it gives you a good idea of how it's going to look when it's framed or mounted. I found that having at least one quite dark color gives it a lot of depth, makes it more interesting. I'm just dropping color in here. The other thing you can do if you're feeling experimental, which you should be with this process, is you can tilt the material too. If you want these things to kind of run together in interesting ways, you can just grab a corner and make it run and get these kind of beautiful effects, a marbling effect. The other thing you can do is spray it lightly, and if you wait a moment, you'll notice that things are starting to run in interesting ways. Sometimes you just, with this process, you have to just get it wet and see where it all goes. If you have an uneven surface for your table, as I often do when I'm working, what happens is that the watercolor will run together and create these puddles, or sometimes a stream of it will just run from side to side through the painting because the work surface isn't completely flat. I find that very interesting, actually, and it makes an interesting effect in the painting. So don't worry if you've got bumps or your floor isn't completely level. It doesn't hurt. Now remember with this process that whatever you put down first is what's going to show from the other side. If that's how you choose to show this work, not from the work side, but from the opposite side. Whatever you put down first, whether it's brush strokes or what have you, that's going to show through the bottom. So you might want to be thinking about what color you want to predominate, or if you have some brush strokes or some textures you wish to put in, you might want to do that first before you go back in with more color. Now this is where the gouache comes in. And I use white in this instance. Sometimes I use black around on the watercolor. But it shows through the other side quite beautifully. And you can see the lovely flow patterns and effects you can get from this. Sometimes you have little places on the acetate where it seems to resist the paint, and that's perfectly all right too. When it's turned over, it's actually rather nice having that quiet space there. Okay. Now you can also do things if you want patterns of some kind. You can draw a brush end through. You can make little marks. You can do your mark making. You can make little patterns if you wish. Maybe little sea creatures, if that's what you're interested in. Water spiders, I don't know, whatever you think. Alright, now notice that this is very, very, very wet. This is how wet it needs to be before you add your encaustic. Okay, now this is very, very wet. If you need to give it another spritz just to make sure you can. Here's your melted encaustic. And I just kind of drop it on there. Notice what happens to the encaustic. It makes these kind of little flower shapes. It interacts. Okay. Now, this is another interesting part. You can take a clean wet brush and you can move these around if you like. You can group them if you want to make little shapes. The watercolor under the encaustic, since it's kind of floating on the top of the watercolor, when it dries, makes the most interesting patterns on the encaustic from the underneath side. Kind of concentric circles, and you're actually looking through the watercolor at the bottom of the encaustic. Now, something I like to do when I have the encaustic kind of where I want it is I might go back in with some color and just daub it on top of the encaustic. The reason being that it makes, again, it adds a little bit more color to what you see from underneath. And should you choose to show these pieces from the work side, you can see that the watercolor makes a lovely beaded pattern on the pieces of wax. Just make sure you move them around a little bit so that there's watercolor underneath them, because that's where it really gets beautiful. Okay, now this will take a while to dry. In fact, it may, depending on your weather and time of year, it may take just overnight, or it may take a couple of days, particularly if you have a lot of puddling in one area. But it needs to be completely dry before you turn it over. And when you do turn it over, little samples here, you'll have something that looks sort of like this. Now, at that point, you may wish to go back into the piece. You may think, oh, you know, I would like a little more encaustic on that. You can see these interesting patterns where the encaustic is. We're looking through the watercolor to the bottom of the encaustic droplet. You may think, oh, I want a few lines, I want a shape, I want maybe even a little more encaustic on there. Well, you can wet the whole thing down again. You can go back in and drop more watercolor in places that you think you might like it. If you get it all wet again, really sopping wet again, you can go back in and add more encaustic. Sometimes the pieces, it seems like, are truly done the first time, and other times they're not quite. And you may want to go in with some more color or some more encaustic, depending on what you're after. And that's it.